Hi, I'm Karla Jones, Senior Director of Federalism, Homeland Security, and International Relations here at ALEC, and I am thrilled to introduce Michelle Bekkering, National Engagement Director at the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. Michelle is a longtime advocate for women's empowerment and equality and was a leading architect of the White House-led Global Development and Prosperity Initiative, which was a whole of government project to economically empower 50 million women worldwide by 2025. Before joining USGLC, Michelle was nominated by the president and unanimously confirmed in a U.S. Senate that never agrees on anything as an assistant administrator at the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. And while she was at USAID, she received a Superior Accomplishment Award for her leadership. Because we're ALEC, I have to mention that Michelle is from Iowa. And when I was putting together the materials for this video, I started remembering back almost 20 years when a mutual friend of ours mentioned to me over a lunch, a guy from the Hungarian embassy to the US, that I had to meet Michelle Bekkering. He kept saying to me, Karla, you must meet Michelle Bekkering. She is amazing. Well, that guy, Vilmos, he was absolutely right. You are amazing. And you are an excellent person to discuss with us the state of global women's issues in honor of Women's History Month. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you, Karla. Thank you for having me here. And I have to say, the admiration is mutual.
Oh, thank you so much, Michelle. Well, first, would you like to tell us a little bit about USGLC, especially any work that you've been doing in the global women's issues space? I'm not sure our viewers are familiar with your organization and some of the tremendous work that you guys do.
Yeah, thanks for that, Karla. And again, thanks to ALEC for having me here. I have had the great privilege to be connected with your very strong and impressive network of state legislators, throughout the country over the past few years. And I'm always really delighted when I have the opportunity to talk to your state leaders. And I'm also glad you mentioned I'm from Iowa, because if you hadn't, I would have invariably brought it up at some point anyway, because I'm quite proud of my home state. So let me talk a little bit about where I'm at now. You mentioned I spent the last 4 years at USAID under the Trump-Pence administration, and now I'm at the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. And it's been a great opportunity to give me the ability to really continue to advocate for these issues that I feel so strongly about. And I'm so delighted at that we're going to get to talk about women's empowerment and equality, and specifically women's economic empowerment, because I don't think this is something we should just talk about when it comes to foreign policy. This is really something that I think all of us can have a stake in. So at USGLC, and hopefully, because I know many of your ALEC legislators are members of ours, we're a broad-based coalition. And what really sets us apart, I think, is our unique, and diverse network, right? We are businesses, we're humanitarian organizations, we're military veterans, faith-based leaders, state leaders, and foreign policy and national security leaders. And what brings this really unique coalition together is that we believe in the importance of America's global leadership and how vital it is. And so what we often talk about is threefold. We believe that strategic investments in diplomacy and development, which we often think of as, let's say, soft power tools, right? That we need to do this because it protects our national security, it advances our economic interests, and frankly, it projects the very best of our American values. So we oftentimes are advocating for this tiny percent of the federal budget. It's actually less than 1% of the federal budget, and it's called the International Affairs Budget. And why we support this is because we believe it is actually one of the most cost-effective and powerful investments America makes. And we do this because we believe it actually has a quantifiable return on our taxpayers' investment. And that's so important. We look at these funds, that are granted so generously by taxpayers as investments, right? These are not handouts. These are investments America is making because we understand what it does for us here at home. I'll give you a couple quick examples. We know this, your states know this full well. Right now, international trade supports about 1 in 5 jobs in the United States. But we also know 95% of the world's population lives outside of our borders. And that's about 75% of the world's purchasing power, right? So if you look at who we're doing this trade with, right, and how our economy is benefiting, I always point out to people today, 11 of the US's top 15 trading partners, former recipients of US assistance, right? These were investments not only in these countries, but in our own economy. And that matters. That matters in your states, and that matters across our country. So USGLC, of course, also supports, as we're talking about this international affairs, development, diplomacy, women's global empowerment, because it ties directly to what we're talking about. We know that no country can prosper. No country can do well if it's really avoiding capitalizing on 50% of its population, or leaving them behind, omitting them from leadership and equal participation. So for our world to be more prosperous, more stable, which of course means our own country is more prosperous, that the world itself is stable, we need to increase women's participation and leadership in all roles, and that includes women's economic empowerment.
Thank you so much for making those points, Michelle. Back in 2017, we worked together with USGLC and produced a video that explained how important America's soft power toolkit is and what a great return on investment the United States gets on it. So the next question is, I know in this country, COVID and honestly, America's response to COVID disproportionately affected women on everything from job vulnerability to limited access to healthcare to the uptick in domestic violence. How was the impact on women outside our country? Did COVID disproportionately impact women overseas in the same way that it impacted women here? Or was it pretty much equal between men and women in terms of the impact?
So it's a great question. And unfortunately, it impacted women more. And so to such an extent, if I may, Karla, it was actually startling. And I think when we started, I was at USAID at the time, but we continue now to sort of track the repercussions of the pandemic and how, as you noted, even here in the United States, right, the deep impact it had on every sector from healthcare, to education, to the economy. I think we continue to see time and time again that women were disproportionately affected. And so as someone who was really tuned into, global metrics, I mean, what our research was showing us probably shouldn't have been a surprise, because women were already, when you looked at the baseline data, right, disproportionately, affected in so many of these sectors before. And then COVID, just highlighted and exacerbated this. So let me talk about the really grim statistics today, right? Because of the COVID pandemic, our research shows us 47 million women and girls have now been pushed into extreme poverty. Okay. More women have lost employment and continue to be out of it. Areas that are so touching to my heart, and I know others on this call, are when we also look at things like child and early forced marriage. Right now, it is estimated that an additional 10 million girls were put at risk of early and forced marriage, again, because of the extreme situations we saw with poverty, with insecurity around the world. And then schooling, right? Where already we are concerned about the levels of girls' participation in school around the world, it's estimated that 11 million more girls whose education was disrupted, like so many children, by the pandemic, will never go back into school. And that's startling, right? That's 11 million girls whose education was disrupted and now halted. And as you noticed, I think one of the really shocking statistics we were seeing is the almost immediate and quickly increasing numbers of, rising levels of gender-based violence. Mm-hmm. And that included physical violence. It included sexual violence and assault, and also, of course, emotional abuse. And in fact, when we looked at data in some countries, that was up 40%. So why? Was it just COVID? Yes. As I said, it exacerbated so many already happening gender disparities, right? So if you think about it, and this is a large part of why we look at women's global economic empowerment, women already had started off at a disadvantage, right? They hold less formal sector jobs than men, right? They have higher levels of what we call unpaid care work and familial responsibilities, right? So what we saw during COVID is women were often the first to lose their jobs, the first to leave their jobs. And oftentimes, because like so many of us, right, they had children at home from school that they were now trying to help educate. They had sick family members, right? And they were caring for them. And we also recognized, as we saw the world begin to come out of COVID-19 and economies start to rebuild, that again, because women going into the pandemic globally had less access to, let's say, secure jobs, jobs with benefits, with social protections, they were just simply unable to, absorb any economic shocks and then find their ways back into an economy. And so it was this understanding of this really faulty ground that women across the world were on that was actually one of the reasons we created WGDP.
Thanks for that, Michelle. I'm really sorry that that was your answer, but I suspected that it had impacted women globally in the same way that it did here, only more so. One of the things I mentioned in my intro was that you were a leading architect of the Women's Global Development and Prosperity Initiative, which is a great example of how U.S. foreign policy and our foreign policy institutions can be leveraged to promote gender parity. Could you tell us a little more about that project? What were some of the ways that it sought to empower women? I'm guessing increasing access to economic and educational opportunities would have been part of it.
Exactly. And thank you for the opportunity. I am so grateful to be able to talk about WGDP, which I laughingly always say is one of the best acronyms to ever come out of a government initiative. And people remember it. But as I said, at the end of the last question, while WGDP was launched in 2019, right, and came before COVID pandemic, it really was this very timely initiative that recognized these disproportionate needs women had across the world. And it was launched in 2019 by then President Trump. And it was led by advisor to the president, Ivanka Trump. And I really want to give Ms. Trump credit for her dedication to the initiative and for her leadership. And it really, truly was a remarkable and impactful initiative. So to kind of set the stage for what was WGDP, it's important to note this was actually the first whole of U.S. government approach to advancing women's economic empowerment. And when it was launched, it actually brought together the support and strength of 10 U.S. government agencies and departments, right? So State Department, USAID, Peace Corps, et cetera, to really come together because we recognize, right, in our various work, we recognize the correlation there was between women's economic empowerment and global prosperity and stability. And we also recognize that not only would women be impacted, but that when we empower women, right, we see a multiplier effect. And we see actually an increase in gains in other development outcomes. So when WGDP was launched, it was very thoughtful and very targeted. It recognized that if we were going to say, okay, we have economically empowered women, we had to be able to define what does that mean and how are we going to do it. So WGDP followed a 3-pillar strategy. So pillar 1 was women prospering in the workforce. And this was really designed to make sure women had the skills and the networks to be able to compete for and to be granted jobs that were good paying jobs in the skilled sector, right? So we looked at making sure they had this education. We also make sure that they had the opportunity, right, to be part of this economy. Second was looking at women who were entrepreneurs and recognizing there were so many challenges in their way for women who wanted to either create or who had already a small business who wanted to accelerate and grow their business. And the third, and sometimes I would say this was the most crucial, we looked at women enabled in the economy. This recognized that for all of our efforts, systematic, sustainable change wasn't going to happen unless we made sure there was the legal and regulatory framework that allowed it to happen. At the time we launched WGDP, I'll give you this statistic, 197 countries around the world had at least one law still on their books that did not allow women to have the same jobs as men.
Wow.
197, right? We also recognize in a lot of the countries where we were focusing our efforts, women did not have the ability to purchase property, to lease land, right, on their own, or to even apply for credit. And so we recognized for this to take place, we really had to hone in on those structural frameworks. WGDP's goal, when it was launched in 2019, was to reach 50 million women in the developing world by 2025. And to do this, several things happened. First, President Trump requested and Congress approved dedicated funding for this initiative. Then we worked to create partnerships with the private sector, both U.S. companies and international companies, to enhance our impact. Why is this important? We know, and I've spent a lot of time working on economic portfolios throughout my career, that the fastest way and the most powerful way to lift someone out of poverty is through private enterprise. And so the private sector, right, with its innovation, with its revenue, and also with its jobs, was crucial to the success of WGDP.
That's wonderful. And were there specific countries targeted? And is it on track? Is the program on track to reaching the 50 million women worldwide by 2025? I know a lot has happened since 2019.
In 2 great questions. Let me start with the first. We had a lot of thoughtful discussions about should we target specific countries, because we all know when we look at development indicators, right, there are some countries who really do struggle in meeting their goals. But what we decided, and these were discussions with, not only our government agencies, right, but with women activists, with our embassies, with our USAID missions in the field. We recognized we did not want to unintentionally, sort of restrict the global reach we could have. Because when we looked at the data, the first thing that was clear is, a lack of women's meaningful participation in the economy or women's poverty, it isn't just owned by one country or region. It's so widespread. And so we decided that we would prioritize support for projects that have the potential not only for impact, but sustainability, right? These, again, when I talk about foreign assistance, I talk about it through this lens of investments, right? Where can we make a difference as the U.S. government through funding? Where can the private sector make an investment through its networks, supply chains, et cetera? And where is there the local, let's say, buy-in from governments, from local communities to carry this on? And that was really important to us. So the true success, I would say, of WGDP was, first of all, that we recognized that this would be most impactful when we designed it to be efficient and effective. And I'm really proud to that end. I believe the last estimates I had were over 160 private sector entities were involved in this. We had countries all across the world devoting their own resources to supporting this, working to change the laws. And so it was a huge success. But not only was it great in the partnership, we were so pleased. So if I talk about the first 2 years alone, right, and keeping in mind we were looking at 50 million women over 5 years, in the first 2 years alone of WGDP, we hit our goal halfway. We had already had the data to show we had economically empowered 24 million women. And I want to point out here something that anyone who has worked in a grant setting will know. Metrics are important, right? It's not enough for me to say, Karla, we hit it. We empowered 24 million women, unless I tell you what that looks like, right? We wanted to make sure that people understood that empowerment meant actual impact. So this could mean everything from a law in a country was changed to allow a woman on her own, to apply for credit. It might mean that a tangible number of women were connected to global supply chains to sell their businesses. It might mean a number of women who received STEM, so science, technology, engineering, and math training, and then that it resulted in them getting paid jobs in certain sectors. So we developed really rigorous metrics because, again, as always, we wanted to show American taxpayers just how impactful this program was and what it was really equating to.
Thank you. On behalf of women everywhere, you made a difference in the lives of millions of women. Thank you for your leadership on that. And thank you also for making the point that where we often think in terms of gender equality, we think of it as a social issue or a moral issue, but it is so much more than that. It is an economic issue. One of the things that has always struck me is back in 2015, I read this McKinsey Global Institute study that predicted that $12 trillion could be added to global GDP in a decade if each country within these regions specified in the report matched the performance of the best performing country in their particular region. Another statistic that's always stuck with me is that 26% could be added to global GDP in 10 years if full gender parity were achieved. Now, I know it's unrealistic. You're never going to have full gender parity because there are always going to be individual choices that affect that. But global GDP lags when women are not empowered, and a country's GDP lags when women are not empowered. Could you go into that in a little more detail?
Yes, and I'm glad you asked the question. I'm going to start by saying this. I think back to when you and I first met those decades ago, right? And we were both involved in advocacy. And I think what the conversation was then, and it was so different, right? There had just at that time become sort of a more wider, I would say, global attention to women's empowerment and equality. And the good thing is that really started out with this conversation about, this is the right thing to do. Women should, not be faced with these, gender disparities. Women are equal to men, right? They're half the population, right? They should have the same, human rights, et cetera. And now when we're talking about it, I'm just thinking of the mind-boggling stats you just laid out. We've realized it's not only the right thing to do, which it is, it's the smart economic thing to do. And while we have a ways to go, the power of the possibility is what we need to take away from those stats you just outlined. This is an area of just unbridled potential, and we are seeing efforts pay off. We are seeing impact. So one of the things, there's this quote I like to use here, and it was from, at the time, Robert O'Brien, who was, of course, the National Security Advisor, and he is now on USGLC's National Advisory Council. And I thought he stated this so beautifully. And it really, I think, showed our shift in talking about why invest in this, right? What does this really matter? And especially, I think to Americans, or maybe, people who are blessed to live in other countries, right, who really have, made success in these arenas. And he just said, listen, women's empowerment is a core facet of U.S. foreign policy, and it's a stated, it's a stated priority action in our national security strategy. We know that women's full and free participation is critical to sustaining peaceful and prosperous societies. And when women have access to opportunities and the abilities to reach their potential, we're all going to benefit. And so this became really more so than, the right thing to do. We recognize the intrinsic links it has, again, to prosperity, to stability. And I would also, talking about the economy, right? And to your point, I mean, this 26% that could be added to global GDP is just incredible. But we could break that down further. It also has to do, with things at the micro level, like how we could relieve and alleviate poverty, right? And just recognizing that in countries, right, where women, have access to their own money, right? So they have, not only are they able to, let's say, make and earn their own money, but they also can control their finances, right? We have seen that 90% of this income is invested right back into their families. What does that mean? They're probably buying local goods and services from their communities. They're starting co-ops. There's micro lending going on between women. We also saw that when we looked at where are women spending that money, they're spending it primarily on their children's education and healthcare. So what do we have now? We have girls going to school. We have more children, period, going to school. And we're seeing better health outcomes for the entire family. So this is really important, not only in an economic sense, but really recognizing the force multiplier this has against not only a family, but then a community, and then their society at whole. Because we have seen that countries that have higher levels of gender equality, what do we know? They're more prosperous, and they are much less prone to conflict or crisis.
And this wasn't one of the questions I expected to ask you, but since you brought it up, is there a contrast between how men spend money when they get loans, for example, and how women tend to spend money?
So I do not at hand have the latest research on that, but yes, it has been looked into. And what I can largely give you is sort of the reverse, where we know women are primarily spending their money. What data had shown us, and again, I don't want to quote the exact figure here, is that it was not at the same level that, let's say, men were investing in the family, in things like education, in childcare. And so this was really important. What we also knew and was concerning to us was that women just had such less access to funds, even if it was, money they had earned. And this made a big difference, which again was part of our WGDP pillar, to make sure women had access to the earnings they were making.
Thanks. I've read the same figures and don't have them at hand, but I've seen studies that suggest that sometimes women, when they get money, they spend it in a way that ends up not just benefiting their families, but benefiting their entire social structure, their village, and ultimately their nation. And are there countries, especially ones that maybe we think of as not being so good at women's empowerment, that have made enormous strides recently? And also, are there countries that still keep you awake at night, where they're not only not moving forward, they're moving backwards?
So the happy and sad answer to the question is yes to both. And let's start with sort of where we not seeing progress, right? And I'll be candid, this can be a little bit tricky, especially for those of us in the development who have spent a lot of time in the development sector, right? Because oftentimes it's country by country, but often where we see data is region by region. And so if I were to look at a list of countries who were, faring the least on development outcomes, it might be different from a region at whole. So what we often do is try to look at set criteria. And a resource that I have used for decades actually is the World Economic Forum's Gender Gap Index. And this comes out every year and looks at a framework of 4 areas for those in the practitioner community to really be able to chart countries and then regions having made progress. The first pillar, of course, is the one we talked about, which was the economic participation and opportunity. Then they look at educational attainment. Third, of course, is health and survival. And fourth is that political participation and leadership. And so if you were to look at their findings by region, right, North America leads all of the regions in closing those 4 gender gaps. And unfortunately, the reverse is that it's the Middle East and North Africa and then South Asia really have struggled with closing those gender gaps. But we also see, of course, a lot of issues, if we were to look country by country specific, of sub-Saharan Africa, where we see, when you look individually, there are countries that really continue to struggle. So I say that to say it is something we think about quite often, because it's really where we need that data in order to structure, right, our programs, as well as to really think about where to target our efforts. I would also say this, there are positives too, but let me kind of stay on the topic of, where do we see concerns? And you asked the right question. You phrased it so beautifully, actually. It's what keeps you up at night. And I can't think of a better way to say this, and it's Afghanistan. And Karla, you and I, friends of ours, we have had ad nauseam conversations about this. And I want to thank ALEC for bringing this up at its last policy conference as well. And I will tell you right now, I cannot sleep for worrying about the women and girls in Afghanistan. And the repression by the Taliban, it was swift and it was brutal. And I just want to set the stage so that our listeners understand. First, it's not only women and girls in Afghanistan. Right now, 2/3 of the entire population of the country of Afghanistan are in dire need of humanitarian and protection assistance. 2/3. It's a catastrophe. It's really a humanitarian crisis. But then we have to understand disproportionately, again, this has affected women and girls. So what's happened? Well, since the Taliban took over, women are now wholly excluded from public office, right? From serving, from being in the judiciary. Women, again, have to follow a very strict dress code. And women are not permitted to travel more than a certain small distance unless they have a male relative. And that includes crossing the border. Education sector for women and girls is being decimated. Right now, any girl over the age of 12, think about that in our terms here, middle school, is precluded from going to school. So that's secondary education, that's college. That's 80% of all secondary girls out of school. Women who are in university, the same thing. 100,000 female students are now unable to complete their university degrees because they can no longer go to university. So education sector. Then we look at employment. There has been a almost 1/3 decrease, so 28% decrease in women's employment in this last year, right? The Taliban has banned women now from working from any NGO, international, national, etc. We've seen 84% of women journalists no longer working in the country. And so this has left the entire country really just in a dire economic situation. And so, of course, we've seen an uptick in what? In child and early forced marriage, right? Last year, it is estimated 88% of the children who are forced into marriage were not surprisingly girls. And that number is of course, rising. 100% of any female-headed household is now, facing insufficient food consumption. We're seeing malnutrition rates go up, suicide rates among women go up. It goes on and on and on. This is a catastrophe for the country, for the region, and for the world. And we cannot close our eyes to what is happening. But let me end this by saying, do not give up on the women and girls in Afghanistan and those who worked so closely with us the past 2 decades. Spend time. Your state legislators, get to know those who worked with the United States. Many are now domiciled in your home states. They tell the story of the possibility, right? These were women and girls and men who gained so much by the opportunities afforded to them through democratic initiatives. They don't want to see their country fail and collapse either. They have hope. They just need us to stand with them. And there is hope around the world. I have had the chance to work in over 70 countries. And every time I go into a country, I never leave without feeling deeply impacted by the bravery and the commitment. People want freedom. People want opportunity. They love their children. They want peace. They want prosperity. But they are oftentimes confronted with daunting challenges. I tell this story, and I hope you don't mind, an illustrative story of work that I did in South Sudan years ago. And at that time was following the ceasefire of the 20-year-old very, very bloody civil war. Mm-hmm. And we were training a new group of women legislators who were going to serve in the national parliament of the new country of South Sudan. And Karla, these women, I cannot tell you how impacted I was. So after 20 years of surviving a brutal civil war, I met with these women and they began to tell me their stories. Most of them did not know how old they were because they were born during a war and at a time when births couldn't be recorded. Many told me the sheer brutality of the war and having to bury their children that died in little baskets that they sent down the Nile because there was no other opportunities. Most of these women were illiterate because they had never had the opportunity to even go to school. And yet they walked hours to the capital city of Juba to sit and to learn and to be part of the building of this new country. Human possibility can do anything. Human hope is incredible. And the hope that they showed is the hope I have seen at so many other women who have come out of situations to say, our past will not define us. The future has possibilities. And so there is so much hope. And so we can never give up because there are so many women around the world sacrificing at great cost, and we need to stand with them.
Thank you so much for mentioning Sudan. I believe back when I was first at ALEC, we worked with the Women's Democracy Network at IRI, and we published one of those articles about democracy, or the nascent then, democracy in Sudan. And thank you for mentioning Afghanistan. Some of the work that our task force has done on Afghanistan is some of the proudest work I think I've done at ALEC. We had model policy in place before the fall of Kabul that sought to evacuate the people of Afghanistan, that had helped both American and NATO troops during the war. We had the women's caucus roundtable that you moderated at our annual meeting in Salt Lake City, and we'll be showing an article that contains a video that you made with then Ambassador Roya Rahmani, talking about what was going on in Afghanistan. And that was, we didn't know at the time, but just about 2 weeks before the fall of Kabul. And the podcast that we recorded on the fall of Kabul in late August 2021 is still ALEC's most downloaded podcast ever. So thank you for mentioning that. And we have invited some potential panelists to record next week. We're still waiting to hear back, to just discuss Afghanistan in honor of Women's History Month. Is there anything else that you'd like our viewers to take away from this video?
Yes, thanks for that, Karla. I would say this, and again, I want to thank you particularly for your leadership in ALEC and for all the work you've done all these decades that I have known you really to advocate for others. And I want our listeners to leave with this. What happens internationally is not just someone else's problem. What happens internationally absolutely affects us here locally. We live in a day and age where the world is increasingly interconnected. Our economy, health, as we've seen, in all these areas. And so we need to, first of all, continue to educate ourselves on what's happening overseas. Second, as Americans, we need to continue to stand up for our allies and our partners across the world who are continually being faced with rising authoritarianism and attack from malign actors. I'm going to take a moment to talk about the brave freedom patriots in Ukraine who are working so hard at great cost to defend their country against the invasion by Russia. We have so much blessing in this country to live in a free country, and we need to continue to stand up for and support our brothers and sisters around the world who are facing these attacks. And lastly, I would say there's a role everyone can play in this. It could be from, getting to know diaspora communities in your neighborhood to learn more about their situations. It's absolutely a role for legislators at every level to be thoughtful and to recognize what support for global programs and initiatives means, not only across the world, but here at home. And so I thank you for your attention to this. I thank you for your support specifically of women and girls around the world. And we look forward to ways we can continue to collaborate to make sure their voices are heard.
And Michelle, I want to thank you for your phenomenal leadership globally for more than 2 decades. I want to also thank you for always being willing to speak to ALEC members and for being able to reach them. I also want to thank you for being the first person I always call when I need to find a speaker on this or that issue. I mean, you helped with our Ukraine Policy Hour. Oh, and by the way, we're also trying to schedule a video with a Ukrainian MP to talk about the unique threat to women in Ukraine, both POWs and civilian females. And I look forward to seeing you at future ALEC conferences. Thank you, Michelle.
I look forward to being there, and thank you, Karla.